Sorry about that, alarms. But when it heals, what you're left with is a scar. And that scar will stay with you the rest of your life. But having scars is better than open wounds, open and fresh wounds. We don't want to have those things. So let it heal, let it scar, and let that scar remind you of the wounds, what happened, how it happened. Let it be a lesson to you in life, and show it to people who also have wounds, and say, hey, here's how I can relate to you. I got wounds too, man. And it's healed. And I want to be here for you and help you with your wound that needs to heal as well. It takes time though. It's not done in one day, but it can happen. You can overcome this. You can do this. You don't need all that other stuff. You can do it. So it's something that I'm really passionate about as somebody who has and does struggle with depression. I find my peace when I am outside of myself and not just bottling everything up, but putting myself in vulnerable situations with people who love me. So that all being said, thank you guys for your prayers. Continue to pray for my mom and my aunt. They're the ones who really need it right now. So excuse me, because I mean I'm fine. I didn't, like I said, I didn't cry really. I got a little bit emotional because of my mom and my aunt, for their sakes. But I guess I didn't have a connection with my grandma that would do that to me, I guess, which is unfortunate, but I still loved her. Absolutely. I absolutely loved her. And I'm so glad I got to see her on Thursday night, because it was only a matter of hours later. It was about, almost a day later that she'd passed away. So I'm so glad I got to see her. And I'm so glad that when she saw me, she recognized me. My other grandma, when it was hard for that one because she didn't recognize me anymore. And that was too much for me. I couldn't do it. And that one time I saw her was the last time I saw her conscious anyway. And I regret not seeing her sooner, because I cowered and went, I can't deal with this. She doesn't recognize me. But when I saw my grandma this time, I still had that fear that she wasn't going to recognize me. That's one of the reasons why I was reluctant to go. I was like, I'm gonna go and see her. And when she looked up at me, her eyes are very, and she smiles, and I just knew it. So she recognizes me. So I said, hi, Grandma, and I love you. So I'm glad I was able to do that. And especially for her, let her see her family in those last moments of her life. So, but anyways, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start getting into the Reformation. And I guess what I want to do here is we're going to do like an introduction to it. And the purpose here is not the entirety of the Reformation. That's going to take us much longer than what it usually is going to take. What I want to do is just kind of every Saturday up until the last week of October, which I think, when does October 31st? October 31st is a Monday. Okay, so what I might do is I might do the last video on October 31st, because that is the day when Luther, allegedly anyway, hammers his 95 Thesis on the Wittenberg Castle church door, and the significance of that. But yes, and that is on Halloween, but I don't think they had Halloween back then. But yes, that is on Halloween Day, what we consider Halloween Day, October 31st, 1517. 1516, I think, actually. Now I think about it, I think it's 1516. But anyways, so yeah, now it's bugging me. I gotta make sure I get that right. Real quick here. It was 1517. Yes, it was. It was 1517. Okay. Yes, that's what it was. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to do a little series of videos here. I've always wanted to do this because I love Reformation Month. I personally, would, and let me just preface it this way. I was talking with my pastor last Sunday, and he doesn't know much about any of this stuff. He's not really, but he wants to. He's actually kind of interested in us, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to do this, because I was explaining a lot of this stuff to him, because he was like, he's not so hip on Halloween. He's not sure about it. He doesn't know what he should think about it, and I think there's good reason for that. And I'm glad he's thinking about that kind of stuff. And I'm in the same boat as him. I'm like, I don't really know what to think about Halloween either. I mean, I'm not going to be one of those jerky Christians on Facebook who are just calling all the other Christians who celebrate Halloween in their own ways as just a bunch of pagans. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to give you a hard time over it. In fact, some people at my church have invited me to a sort of a costume party later this month, and I'm thinking about going. Maybe I might, and just go have fun. But I know that they're not pagans. They're not just celebrating evil. They're just having fun, and they're just, they don't think much about any other stuff. So, but still, I do think, I personally believe that October 31st and October itself for Christians could be used in a much more productive sense. And the sad reality is, like my pastor, there's just so much ignorance on this issue. But my pastor he's actually interested in learning about it. And I'm glad he is. And so that kind of inspired me to do this. And so because I was, like I said, I was explaining a lot of this stuff to him, and I was trying to condense it so much, because there's, as you're trying to explain something to somebody, especially when you nerd out on these things, details upon details start adding on to each other. And the next thing you know, one little tiny explanation you're trying to do, it just blows up into, now you've been talking to him for like an hour explaining all this stuff. And you're in a mess, you're all over the place. But that's kind of what happens to me. So I realized, I can't just do this in just a quick little comments. It's going to take some time to talk about everything I want to talk about. And so, so I decided, why don't I just go ahead and try to do that little series that I wanted to do. And I'll try to release a new chapter, as it were, or a new episode every Saturday until all the way through October. And then the final one being on October 31st, the 95 Thesis. Well, you know what? Actually, the 95 Thesis is going to come before that, because what I want to do, now I'm thinking about it, but what I want to do is I want this to go all the way up into Worms, when Luther is at the Diet of Worms, and that comes later from the 95 Thesis. So it wouldn't make sense for me to skip the one date, go to the next one, and then then flip it all around. That's not how you really want to do history and stuff. So it's going to confuse people, and it's already confusing me as I try to think about it. But so what we're going to do here is we're kind of just introduce things and introduce you, of course, to Martin Luther. Now, when I say Martin Luther, by the way, when I talk about Martin Luther, I am not talking about Martin Luther King Jr. Okay, two different people, and that's one of the sad realities of all of this is. So many people, like when I first heard the name Martin Luther years and years ago, I'm thinking Martin Luther King Jr. because you're inculcating in American history and not a whole lot in world history itself, that you don't realize that even Dr. King named after the German monk Martin Luther, which is ironic, because if Luther ever found out that Dr. King, who had some seriously bad views and heretical views, denying the virgin birth and the deity of Christ, if Martin Luther ever found out that guy was named after him, Martin Luther would probably kill himself. That my name has been attributed to that man. I think Martin Luther might have a heart attack and then die on the spot. So that's kind of a level of irony right there. But the Martin Luther, the actual Martin Luther, the one that we're talking about here, born centuries before Martin Luther King Jr., Martin Luther was a German monk in Germany during the latter years of the Renaissance in the 16th century. Yeah, 16th century. At the very beginning of the 16th century, he becomes a monk in the Augustinian order, and eventually starts the firestorm, which causes the Reformation, leading to the Protestant world that we live in, and it really does. This is why one of the reasons why it's significant. The Reformation is so significant is the Western world that we know of today wouldn't exist without the Reformation. The United States would not exist without the Reformation. Even democratic societies would not exist without the Reformation. Now, did Luther intend that to happen? Probably not. Luther and the Reformers, the original Reformers, it was what we would call a magisterial Reformation. I'm not going to get into that right now. That's much later stuff. But um, ultimately, the point is that they weren't trying to. They call it a reformation, not a revolution. Now, a lot of people who don't like the Reformation, who are typically Roman Catholics, will sometimes call it that it was the 16th century Protestant Revolution. The reason why they want to call it a revolution is because that allows them to develop the narrative that the Reformation was just this monk who doesn't like the Catholic Church for personal reasons and ends up screwing everything up. And wants to destroy all this stuff and just for the sake of destroying it and everything like that, and just this horrible, nasty human being who just the scourge of Western society, kind of stuff like that. And that's simply not the case. As we are going to look into Luther's intention, he never intended to do a Reformation at all. But when the Reformation happened, it was very important for him and the other reformers to not have their cause be seen as a revolution. That is a complete undoing and redoing of society from in a vacuum. It was called Reformation because they wanted to imply it or interject or create, not create, but they wanted to reform the church, because the church had strayed so far away from what it was supposed to be for over 1,000 years. And so what they saw their movement as was not revolution, but reformation, reforming the church. They still held to, because revolution implies, again, you're abandoning ancient concepts completely, and you're developing an entirely new one. But the Reformation wasn't doing that, because the Reformation was about going back to the original, to the original form of the church. So that's not revolution, that's going back to the sources, which is a Renaissance term, ad fontes. Okay, so we're going to get into that kind of stuff like that. But what I want to do here is really emphasize and discuss a couple things. Firstly, that I have my notes here to kind of help me out here, but we can't cartoonize the Reformation. In other words, so there's a couple, especially when you're new to this subject, there's a couple things, there's tendencies in our minds that we have got to actively fight against. And those tendencies are to simplify things, essentially. You can simplify things if you want, but the reality is simplification is not going to give you the real picture of what happened, and therefore a more in-depth and more educational historical understanding. So we don't want to cartoonize Reformation. So like I said, one of the ways we can cartoonize it. So one of the ways we can do it is like I was just talking about. You can just see it as just a revolution of just this evil, horrible, nasty guy named Martin Luther who just wanted to blow stuff up, and that's all he was doing. That's a very cartoonized view of the Reformation. It ignores, and on the other hand, you can fall off the horse on the other side and say that Martin Luther was just this heroic figure who just suddenly realized that the Catholic Church was wrong and corrupt and evil, and he's set out to change it all, and that's what he was doing. That's also not really true. So again, like I said, Luther had no intention of starting the firestorm that he did. Originally that was not. He was part of the Roman Catholic Church. He was a proud member of it. So he was not out to get the Pope or anything like that originally. That's not what he was trying to do. Luther himself describes it as, he sort of bumbled into it, like he's in a, I think he's described it sort of like climbing up in the church tower and then just stumbles and falls and reaches for something to grab, to hold him up so he doesn't fall to his death or whatever, or get seriously hurt, and he happens to grab the church bell and then, rings it and then wakes everybody up in the town. And so in other words, it was totally accidental. It was just like, whoa, he grabs it, bang, and then everybody's like, what, it awakens everybody, as it were. And so that's the way Luther sort of describes it. In other words, it wasn't meant to go the way it went. That's not what he was hoping to happen, as we're going to see as we progress in how it all started. I get some water here, but so yeah, Luther should not be seen as the father of the Reformation. So that's another one of the things is we shouldn't. We also got to remember Luther is not. Again, none of this exists in a vacuum. There were precursors to the Reformation: Jan Hus, John Wycliffe, or Jan Wycliffe. These guys came well before Luther. At least 100 years or so. Wycliffe was even earlier than Jan Hus was about 100 years. Wycliffe came even earlier than that, and they were calling for certain reforms in the church during the medieval, late medieval, or mid medieval period, when they were beginning to realize, hey man, we've kind of drifted off. We've kind of gone off into left field here with this whole thing. We're off the tracks, and we need to come back to the original tracks. Now they didn't end up in as far as Luther went. They still held to some ideas that were a little wrong, but hey, they were on the right track. But like I said, there were things that were happening in Luther's time and before his time that would lead up to Luther eventually taking the positions that he took. I'm not saying that they're the only reasons. Ultimately, Luther took his position because of the conviction of Scripture. But there were things that were happening that gave Luther the understandings that he needed and the biblical witness to recognize these things. So the other thing too that we don't want to do in cartoonizing is we cannot see the Reformation as simply good versus bad or oppressed versus oppressor. Like I said, it's called the Reformation, not a revolution, because the reformers were trying to reform the church back to what it's supposed to be. So the reason why that's important is because it can also be easy and tempting to see this as an oppressed versus oppressor, that Luther was the champion of the oppressed, and he was overthrowing by revolution the government. Again, that's Marxist stuff. That is not what Luther. Again, if Luther, Marx came after Luther, so Luther had no idea who that guy was. But let's just assume that Luther did learn about Marx, and then his Reformation was attributed to Marxism. Luther would be utterly horrified, because Marxism is utterly opposed to Reformation theology. And so again, Luther might have a panic attack and just have a heart attack and die on the spot if that ever happens. If his Reformation was ever attributed to Marxist revolutions. So like the early reformers intended to reform the church to make it closer to the early church before the eventual corruption and piled on unbiblical traditions that corroded it. Like all major events in history, the Reformation is messy. It's complex, and to really get a grasp of it, it's important to have some understanding of the historical context of that time period. And so what I want to, like I said, this is all introduction stuff here, just to give you an idea of the world that Luther was in. At that time, the Renaissance was in bloom. And the Renaissance is, the Renaissance had a significant impact on what led to the Reformation. And these are things you don't really learn in school, by the way. I never learned these things in school. I had to sort of learn them all by myself. So the 16th century humanist, and when we talk about humanism in that day, it's not the same thing as we think about it today. Humanism today is not good, not to say that, but humanism in that day, it was not a purely secularized worldview of anti-religious, anti-God ideas that it is today. Although it had elements that would, you could say when they're followed through logically would lead to where they are today. But those early Renaissance humanists, that's not what they intended by the word. That was another name for people who were focused on what we typically might call, the ad fontes movements and stuff, like Erasmus. And now I'll explain some of these things here for you. So, the 16th century humanist Desiderius Erasmus of Rotterdam. So, he's an important figure in the Renaissance. He was a pivotal figure for the Reformation, although he remained ultimately loyal to the Roman Catholic Church as a priest. Desiderius Erasmus never joined the Reformation, but he had a lot of sympathy for the Reformation, and he wanted some changes in the church, Western Church. But so he had an emphasis on what we call the ad fontes, which means back to the sources. And what that meant is it was bringing the Greek language back into the Western world and just Greek culture, Greek Roman culture. So what basically happened is early on, before the Renaissance and all that stuff like that, there was a split in the Western Church and the Eastern Church. It was back in the 11th century. It was kind of building up to it before that, in the 8th, 9th, and 10th and stuff like that. It was getting bad, and eventually it sort of culminates in the 11th century in the schism of 1054 of the East and the West. And so what eventually happens is the West goes off and does its thing, and what it does is the West abandons the Greek language. Again, this is when the West is really developing into its Middle Ages medieval form. It abandons the Greek, goes with the Latin Vulgate. The Latin Vulgate is the Latin translation of the Bible from Jerome, who was when did Jerome, let's see, I'm trying to remember, I think 5th century. Jerome was a 5th century, I believe, theologian, 4th, 5th, one of those two. I'm pretty sure it's 5th. So he makes what's called the Vulgate. It's a Latin translation of the Bible. And that translation becomes sort of is the translation or the basis of the Western world. And so it kind of abandons the Greek, which is the original language of the New Testament. And of course the Septuagint, which is the ancient Old Testament translation that the apostles used. All right, so I'm name dropping a lot of stuff here. It's a lot of information. Just, when you're done with this, watch it a couple more times. If you're new to this stuff, it's useful for you. But the East goes off and does their thing, and they're still in the Greek, kind of stuff. But anyways, so that's really important, because when the West abandons the Greek, goes with the Latin, even though it doesn't completely obscure the Christian faith, if you don't have access, as it were, to the original languages themselves, there is a level of obscurity, and sometimes that's all it takes to do what eventually happens is 1,000 years of just now warping and distorting the gospel and the Bible. And it got to a point where the Bible could only be read in Latin, and not everybody knew Latin. Only the upper classes of society knew Latin. So how does the average peasant in those days, read God's word? They can't. A lot of them can't even read at all. Education goes sort of on a downward spiral for a while. And so what happens is this lack of access of the common man to the scriptures, unfortunately, allows for evil, corrupt men to take advantage of that. Now, does that mean, again, we got to be careful here, because we don't want to cartoonize all these things. Does that mean that the Roman Catholic Church at this time, or the Western Church, was just for centuries, for a millennia, was evil and wicked and corrupt? That it was just a bunch of wicked, evil men? No, not necessarily. Doesn't mean that every pope was just a maniacal, corrupt, wicked, guy. The Renaissance popes, you can probably argue, were pretty bad, but not necessarily. They were deeply flawed, sure, but it doesn't mean that they were just a bunch of Hitlers running around. So again, you got to be careful. We have to be careful when we talk about these things. I know I'm simplifying it, but I'm also trying to make sure we remember not to simplify it at the same time. So that's just an important note to remember. But The Western Church goes with the Latin Vulgate. Yes, Jerome. I actually have it in my notes here. Jerome was a 4th and 5th century theologian. There you go. Should rely on my notes more often. This change would have a significant impact on Western Christianity in the Middle Ages. Its view of salvation, which led up to the Reformation, things that will be discussed in time. So, the switch to Latin will, as we're going to see later on in Luther's sort of conversion experience, has a major effect on Western society. The what salvation is. I mean, it's soteriology. I mean, it seems like such a small thing, but that small thing has a major impact on the development of Western society during those days, during the Middle Ages, civil society, church, government, everything. It impacts everything. And that's why when Luther discovers the gospel, the impact is just as great. Anyways, but the return of the Greek language, which the New Testament was originally written in, would provided by the Renaissance, had led to a renewed interest in the West for the original language of the New Testament. So this is something I forgot to mention. One of the things that happened, one of the reasons why the Greek world was coming into the West, and which birthed the Renaissance. By the way, Renaissance means rebirth in French. One of the things that did this is the Muslim armies were coming in and pretty much overwhelmed the East, or the Eastern world, which sort of the Eastern Empire, as it were, of the Roman Empire, which was at that time in control of what we call modern-day Turkey, Asia Minor. And the reason why today, it's that whole area is Muslim is because it goes back to all of this. The Turks eventually overcome and take over Constantinople, and it's now today it's Istanbul, but at that time it was Constantinople. It was the capital that Constantine, centuries and centuries and centuries earlier, in the 4th century, moved the Roman Empire, the capital of the Roman Empire, to Constantinople. And then eventually what would happen is the Roman Empire became so vast that you just could not, there's no way one emperor is going to be able to manage all of this. So a future emperor, I forgot his name, but a future emperor eventually does, not Constantine, I don't think, but I have to refresh my memory on this. But he has sort of a guy, kind of like the emperor, but not really, ruling the Eastern world in Constantinople, while he's going to maintain the Western area in Rome. And so you can hopefully picture the split that happens here. And that eventually leads to the split between the East and the West of the empire. And now it gets to a point where they just literally just hate each other, and all that stuff, and all that fun stuff. And so when the East comes under attack by the overwhelming power of the Turks, do you think they're going to get help from the Western guys? They tried to, and again, that's another story in and of itself, a lot of complex stuff going on, but eventually the Western world wasn't coming to help, and so the Eastern world, or the Eastern Church, or not the Eastern, but just the Eastern Empire fell. The Byzantine Empire. I don't know why I just didn't call it that, but that was the Byzantine Empire, eventually collapsed under the power and pressure of the Turks, who eventually took over Constantinople, and it became Istanbul. Now, what was happening, this is where it's significant, is that as it was becoming clear that the Byzantine Empire was going to collapse, a lot of the Greek scholars there, who had all their Greek manuscripts of the New Testament, they brought their manuscripts. They were fleeing the Turks, the incoming Muslims. They were fleeing, and they were going west into the Western Church world, at the Roman Empire, and they bring all their manuscripts, and they also bring their knowledge of the Greek and their knowledge of the ancient language, and all that stuff. They bring all that with them. And this gets sort of intermingled into the West. And now there's a renewed interest in the West of the ad fontes, the sources, the original sources. This is what births, essentially, the Renaissance. And then this is what leads to guys like Erasmus, who creates a fresh new translation of the Bible or the New Testament in Greek. not just in Latin, but now in Greek, which is called the Textus Receptus. Textus Receptus is the basis for a lot of older translations like the King James. But that's kind of what happens, and that's what causes the Renaissance. And in the Renaissance is going to be sort of the catalyst, especially Erasmus and his work is going to be the catalyst of the Reformation. So hopefully what I'm doing here is in a very simple way, providing you just these cool little links in history, how all of this comes together. It's just, like I said, history doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's just one thing leads to another. It's the cause and effect sort of thing. This was the reason why we have this because of this, and then because of that, and it just piecing all this stuff together, I personally think is super cool. So before I end here, I just want to get into Luther's early life. Luther is born in the backdrop of all of this stuff. In Luther's day, in that, I want to just really, in a very simple way, like I said, these are very simple ways, just to sort of give you an idea of society in Luther's day. Remember, all the Renaissance is happening at this point, but in that day, Luther was born in what we would call the Holy Roman Empire. And the Holy Roman Empire was sort of like Central Europe. If you can think of Europe, like kind of like this, and Central Europe is just like all these territories and stuff, little kingdoms that is the Holy Roman Empire presides over. The Holy Roman Empire is sort of, you can trace it back to Charlemagne, Otto, who comes later from Charlemagne. I personally like to trace it back to Charlemagne because I think Charlemagne sort of paved the way for Otto, King Otto, or Emperor Otto. And so that's the kind of way I do it. But these guys came, the 7th, 8th century guys. Was it 8th or 9th centuries? A lot of numbers that I get confused sometimes. But early on in those days, in the 800s, as it were. So Charlemagne was in the 800s. He becomes emperor literally the year 800, crowned by the Pope in the year 800. And then Otto comes later on. But anyways, these guys are pivotal in sort of expanding the Holy Roman Empire's territories into Europe, and what would eventually become what we see today as sort of the nations of Europe sort of thing. But there was a time when that was all under the sort of jurisdiction of the Holy Roman Empire back in the Middle Ages. So this is kind of important because, when you're thinking about Europe, you're typically thinking about it in the today's world, 21st century Western democracies, kind of thing like that. That's not how it was back then. But, a way we can sort of think about it is to use our modern day context. So you can think of the Holy Roman Empire in Luther's day as like the United States federal government. And so what you have the individual states of the United States, and these individual states have their own set of laws and constitutions and stuff like that, state laws and stuff like that. And of course, that's why when you go to one state, you have laws for this, and you go to another one, you have laws for that. They're different, and they all have, of course, a governor that governs over the states. Well, that's kind of the way you can look at it here. Is the Holy Roman Empire is sort of the federal government, and the individual little kingdoms within it are sort of the states, and what they have, and so let me see where I put this here. Who cares? I can explain this. I've lost track of my notes, but we typically, we get a lot of our understandings of medieval world, unfortunately, from little fantasy stories like Disney stuff, which, not unhelpful, but if you rely on that for your understanding of the Western or the medieval world, not a good thing. But so what I mean by this is, the concepts of kings and princes and stuff like that. We typically think about a prince like who's just the son of the king, and there's some of that today with in England. You got the king, and then you got his son who's the prince, all stuff like that. And that wasn't. I'm not saying that's atypical of Western society, but I'm just, for the context of what we're talking about right now, for this, because I'm going to be using these terms later on, and I just think it's really important that you kind of understand what I mean when I use these terms. Prince in this sense is not what we're talking about necessarily. A prince in the Holy Roman Empire doesn't necessarily need to be related to the king. The prince is the ruler over these territories within the Holy Roman Empire. So a way you can look at the prince in this context is like governors of the United States or prime ministers of the nations of Europe, if you're in Europe watching this. That's kind of how you can look at it here. So the prince is like the governor who owns and rules over these territories, states. But he's still beholden to, and he's under, he recognizes the superior role of the king or the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. Also, these princes are really important for the election of the Holy Roman Emperor. So these guys are, when the Holy Roman Empire emperor dies, the princes sort of come together and they elect a new emperor. Now that's different from the United States. So think about it like this: if in the United States, instead of you have the popular votes with the electoral college and all that stuff like that, who vote for our president, if instead you had it to where the governors convened to vote for the president, that's kind of a way to look at it in Luther's Europe. Or Holy Roman Empire. You know, it's really important to talk about Holy Roman Empire because Luther is within the Holy Roman Empire. He's in Germany. So that's really important. That plays a role later on when we talk about the Diet of Worms and then Luther's debate with Cajetan, I think at Leipzig, and all that. It's all going to become really important. So that's why I'm describing a lot of this stuff, to just explain these things to you so you kind of have an idea of the kind of world that Luther is living in during the Reformation or during the time that leads up to the Reformation. One of the things I'm also going to do here, I want to emphasize reason why I'm talking about the Western Church. So there's a couple reasons why I want to make sure I'm sort of mentioning the Western Church versus the Eastern Church. Number one, it helps us understand the historical reality of the Western and Eastern split as it pertains to this series. Early in the Middle Ages, the medieval times, there was what we call the Great Schism of 1054, which was a major split in Christendom between Eastern Europe and Western Europe, particularly in regards to the church. This goes back to Constantine when he expanded the Roman Empire into Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, and moved the capital of Rome to then Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul. The Roman Empire grew too expansive for one man to maintain, so eventually the Roman Emperor had a leader in the east, Constantinople, while he maintained matters in the west. This set the stage for the eventual split between East and West, which climaxed in 1054, so the 11th century, the middle of the 11th century. So the second reason why is, the other reason is because I'm more comfortable using the term the Western Church over the Roman Catholic Church, because that is a later term to distinguish Protestants from Roman Catholics. Protestantism wasn't dealing with the East because it spawned well into Western lands and had little to do with the Eastern Church, which had its own set of problems with the Turks. So for me, it's more appropriate to, in some contexts, speak of the Western Church, particularly when I'm making a distinction between East and West. So that's why I talk about my notes about the governmental structures, which I've just explained to you. So in Luther's day, the Renaissance was in bloom. And the Renaissance, again, is rebirth in French. And it is the period of time in which the Western world rediscovered and indeed fell in love with the ancient Greek and Roman culture. And again, why did this happen? Because as Constantinople is being invaded, it's about to collapse. All of those scholars from that part of the world, the East, flee west. They take all their stuff with them, all their Greek stuff, all their knowledge of the ancients, and all that stuff. And this has an impact on the Western world, which causes the Renaissance. So we got all that under in our minds and everything like that. That's the world that Luther finds himself in. A part of this is the rediscovery of the Greek language, and this inspired the humanist scholar Erasmus to create what would eventually be called the Textus Receptus, a historically significant translation of the Bible into Greek, which became the basis of translations like the King James Bible. In addition, what the Ad Fontes motto brings in is a conflict between what society from the early Middle Ages developed into and the society that existed before that. By this, so what I mean here is that, like I said, the Western world is evolving from what the early church looked like for 1,000 years, essentially, into what it finds itself like in Luther's day, which is really just a perversion of what Christianity is supposed to be about. And one of the reasons why this is due to the abandonment of the Latin and just sort of the burying of sort of where it came from, and never looking back and remembering, hey, maybe we should remember about who we were, where we came from, that kind of stuff. None of that. And so what that ends up doing is what I'm describing here. By this, we recognize that societies always tend to drift from their origins and the foundations that made them what they are. This is no less true for Western Christendom. The abandonment of the Greek for the Latin, while not completely stifling true Christianity, nevertheless clouded it and allowed a complete perversion of what it was meant to be to occur, which was a process of 1,000 years, not simply a single fell swoop action. So when culture and education begins to rediscover the ancient truths, as is true in the Bible, so I was thinking about this. When you have in 2 Kings chapter 22, when the high priest Hilkiah, he finds the book of the law, remember? He finds the book of the law, presumably lost from Israel. When the king discovers it, when it's presented to the king, he realizes, he's like, holy smokes, we're way off, because of rediscovering the law, rediscovering what God originally called for us. So when the king discovers it, the immediate result is to repent and turn back in accordance with the law. That is to reform. That is the way society was decreed to live by God. In the same sense, the Renaissance brought into the Western world the ancient societies that formed the Greco-Roman world and rediscovery of ancient church fathers. And this would lead to conflicts between the scholastics and the humanists, a conflict Luther would find himself in. So finally here, just some notes on Luther. Luther was born November 10th, 1483 to Hans and Margaret Luther. You typically call him Luther and Luther, just sort of distinguish between two. So Hans, Luther's father, was a well-off owner of copper mines, considered to be what we would, probably deem middle-class citizens. So he's a pretty well-off guy. Hans was a very ambitious man, and one of his greatest ambitions was for his son, Martin Luther, to become a lawyer. And one of those reasons was to anticipate one of the reasons is to anticipate his old age, so his son could be well off to take care of him when he's old. Kind of one of the that's one of the reasons, but it's not the only one. Again, be careful not to simplify these characters into just one simple thing that they were into. Okay? Doesn't mean Hans Luther didn't love his son and didn't want the best for his son. You can love your son and want the best for him, but sometimes go about it in the wrong ways. So, but this was far from the only reason. The simple fact is that Hans wanted to have a successful son. You want to be proud of your son, right? So, and this was the path he set his son on. So Luther becoming a lawyer was mainly his father's decision. So that's what Luther pursues. Now, Luther had a troubled relationship with his father. It wasn't abusive like we would typically think of today, but Hans was a very tough, very stern father who expected much from his son. Now, there are some who think Luther's later life actions are a psychological outburst of the tense relationship with his father. And while there may be you could make some psychological evaluations that the way Luther behaves and the way he is, it might be due to that. So, for example, Luther was a very emotional man. He was a very sensitive man, as you can tell when you read about him. And that could be due to the way his father was, the way his father treated him, it could have a lot to do with it. But to say that that's the reason why Luther started the Reformation is simply not true. There were theological, biblical convictions that Luther came to realize that forced him into the position that he found himself in. So that other stuff, that this is all just Luther lashing out at his father, is just not, it doesn't fit the actual history, the actual facts. All right, so Luther, set out to become a lawyer. Luther is educated in Mansfield, and from there he's sent to boarding school in Magdeburg. Finally, in 1501, so at the beginning of the 16th century, when he was 18, Luther went to the University of Erfurt, where some of the most significant periods of his education began. So again, all of this is to prepare him to become a lawyer. And he did really well in school. Luther was a very distinguished, according to the historical records, a very distinguished student. He was very good at it. I mean, this is a guy who poured himself into his studies. He took it very seriously. As you see later in his monastic life and his later Reformation life, he was just so, he took his responsibilities very seriously. So he was a focused young man he finished, I believe, if I remember correctly, reading, he was like second in the class in his class graduation. So he was a very successful, very good student. And that's kind of becomes important later on in his life. But so everything was going well for young Luther. Everything, he was just like set. And, you can imagine old Hans. He's just like, oh, this is great. Oh, my son's gonna be just the greatest lawyer in all of Germany, and I'm gonna be well taken care of when I'm old and dying. But that's the thing with God. God he's gonna throw some curveballs, and this is really good for us to know, because we're talking with my mom and my aunt I almost said my grandma, but my aunt and my mom last night. It sort of indirectly is always the conversation about the kind of life that you were expecting to live and the kind of life you ended up living. So you look at Abraham in the Bible. He's one of my favorite examples. I'm sure Abraham had a specific plan for his life, and then God comes in and just totally throws Abraham a complete curveball. That's what happens with Luther. And this is one of the reasons why I love to talk about these things. I think it's good for us to talk about how we can relate to these characters. You think you got the plans, everything's all set. And then God comes in and just goes, no, we're not doing that. Guess what we're not doing? Yeah, but only a short time in his law studies, a few events happened in Luther's life. One of those events, I think this was earlier on, this is one that's not talked about typically, but I actually read about it in my little history book I have here. And this is one of the basis of my videos here, this book. But Luther actually has a fellow student who dies in school. And I think that has an impact on Luther, and it sort of brings to his mind, don't you always think about when somebody close to you, like my grandma recently, dies, and you start really thinking about eternity. I'm always thinking about now, like, what's my grandma experiencing right now? I mean, what's it like, And then where am I in all of this? Like what's going to be like when I die? Excuse me. You just think about these things. What's my state before God? What's my state? And that's probably what was going through Luther's mind during this time. So a lot of reflection on the state of his soul. Now that was one thing that kind of got him, it kind of pushed him a little bit. Now if that was just a push, Luther was about to get a punch in the face, as it were. So the little push goes, oh, okay. Or you're sleeping, right? You're sleeping and someone just nudges you, you kind of wake up a little bit, should I get up right now? And you just go back to sleep, eventually, because not enough of a nudge. Well, imagine somebody just coming up and just slapping you right in the face. Well, now you're up. So that happens. But here's the other thing that happens. Luther eventually finds himself as he's on a horse. I don't know if he's riding home or what, but he's on a horse on the road. And what Luther describes is a sudden storm arose, and he's almost struck by lightning in the storm. A bolt comes down and almost strikes him. Now, I'm sure every single one of us have had an experience where a lightning strike was just a few hundred yards away at best. And you know it is very close, because as soon as the bolt hits, within a second, the thunder just pounds your chest. You know, it's the sort of the concussion shot from the lightning bolt, as it were. You know that was close, and that was okay. That was a little scary. I'm awake now. I'm up, kind of thing. And that's basically what happens to Luther, and that event sends Luther into a complete panic. And now Luther sees this event as what, you know, R.C. Sproul described as a divine omen on his life. And what that does for Luther is that Luther he just throws everything away. All of law school. I mean, talk about an overnight flip. He throws it all away out of nowhere. He just throws it all away. And what he decides he's going to do, because he's now suddenly concerned about the state of his soul, and he decides to join a monastery. Now, in Luther's day, because Luther is concerned that God's going to kill him because he's a sinner, and send him to hell, and that's what Luther's terrified of. And this is part of medieval life too. This role of salvation. We'll get into that later on, but Luther is scared out of his mind, and so he's driven to a life of monastic. He's driven to a monastic life, not out of a love for God and out of a reverence for God, but a petrified terror of God. That's, I have to do these things or God is going to smite me. I'm surely going to die. That's typically not a good reason to join a ministry or anything like that. But that's why he does it. And so he joins a monastery because it's, in his day, joining a monastery and becoming a monk was a much surer way of salvation for your soul in that day. And now, before we just close real quick here, it's important to note how this makes old Hans feel. Mr. Hans, Papa Hans, ain't happy about that. Remember, he's got his son set. Everything's going well. Can you imagine? You just heard, the other day, hey, your son's report in school or something like that is excellent. Your son is great. He's second in his class and he's well on his way. This kid's got a bright future. And then you sit down for dinner that night and your son decides to suddenly out of nowhere says, Dad, I'm dropping out of school. I'm joining a monastery. Imagine Mr. Hans, Papa Hans, and how he's feeling. He might want to just flip the table and just go crazy. And he does. He goes, he doesn't flip a dinner table or anything like that, but he's absolutely livid with his son. And they already have a pretty tense relationship. But Luther, is thinking about, what is my dad going to do when I tell him this? Oh man, I'm a dead man. But Luther is so absolutely terrified for his soul that he doesn't care, really. He joins an Augustinian order in Erfurt, and that's where Luther's monastic life begins. And so we're going to pick up from there in our next little video. So I hope you enjoyed this. I know it's a little bit messy. I probably got some things wrong, but I'm doing my best here, okay? Trying to condense a lot of things in my mind, but I hope that you guys will stick around for the next one. By the way, I'm not wearing this shirt by accident. This is a sort of a Reformation shirt. It's Simult Justus et Peccator, sorry. And it is a translation that says, at the same time, justified in sinner, which was an important element of Luther's Reformation, which would eventually come. So that's one of the reasons why I'm wearing this shirt. This is that phrase in Latin, by the way, just so you know. All right, so Soli Deo Gloria, guys. God bless. Talk to you later. Bye.